Welcome to the Employment, Law, and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 203 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment solicitor and HR specialist, and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where together with my colleagues we provide advice and assistance to both employers and employees on all aspects of employment law. That can range from preparing contracts through to representation in the employment tribunal. Now, before I get into this week's featured content, I just have a little favour to ask of you. I know a number of you have been in touch with me recently and connected on LinkedIn, so thank you very much. If you listen and you haven't already connected on LinkedIn, then please do. Just search Alison Colley and I'll come up. And my second ask is, if you are listening to this on Spotify or Apple iTunes or any other iTunes type player, podcast player, if you could leave a rating and review, I would be very grateful. I haven't asked for ratings and reviews for quite some time, and it really does help for people to find the show and to get the benefit that you're getting from it. So I'd be very grateful if you could just take a moment to either rate and or like or follow the show. So without further ado, I'm going to get into this week's featured content. Now this week, what I wanted to talk about was managing performance issues. And the reason why I thought I would talk about this is because it's something that's coming up fairly often now in relation to the advice we're giving to employers. So what we're finding is that employers have reached a position with their staff where a number of people are either underperforming or not performing at all, or are just generally being disruptive or causing issues at work. Now, I think that a lot of this is to do with the fallout from COVID, from the furlough years, and from everything that everybody has been going through and has gone through recently. I also think it has a lot to do with the fact that it is an employee-led market now, so employees do have the upper hand because lots of employers are putting up with behaviours that perhaps they wouldn't have before because they know it's going to be very difficult to replace an employee. So even if they're ineffective, actually having someone there is better than having no one, or so they think. And so I think there are a number of reasons why this is happening, but now lots of employers are saying, do you know what? The impact of their poor performance or their lack of ambition or lack of willingness to pull their weight is actually having a detrimental impact on the team. And so we would rather address it and deal with it than let it slide any longer. So I thought I would come up with some tips and hints for you on how to deal with performance and capability issues. Now, the first thing I'm going to say, of course, is that it is all about communication. The key to managing performance issues, to reducing your stress and reducing the time spent managing issues, is communication. So you need to be very clear with employees from the outset what is required of them, and you need to maintain that communication regularly. So if you do have an issue with an employee, my first step is to look inward. I think it's really important as employers or managers that you take some time before you start any formal process or form of process with an individual to look within and see exactly what your role is in that employee's poor performance or lack of performance. So have you set out very clearly to the individual what is required of them? Do they know what is expected? Have you been very clear on your expectations and reassured yourself that they understand what you are saying? Remember, we all come to things from different worldviews, and people's interpretations are very different. You only need to look at some of the misunderstandings that have taken place, or those viral things that come out on social media about people's interpretation of something. You can see from those kinds of things, everybody looks at things differently. You remember the grey or the blue dress scenario. So it's really important that the person understands exactly what is required of them. And then the next thing is to ask yourself, have I given that employee the tools that they need to do their job? Do they have sufficient training? Have I supported them enough? Have I played my part in ensuring that they are successful in their role? And then finally, it's important to ask yourself, does that employee have a disability or any other additional support need that hasn't necessarily been met? Now, when you've been through those questions, you can then move on to the preparation stage. And I think at the preparation stage, it's about identifying if the issue is a skill or a will issue. Now, if it's a skill issue, then there are things that you can do as a manager, of course, to go back to those questions, making sure that they understand what's required of them, that they've got sufficient training, that you have spent time showing them what needs to be done. But if it's a will issue, then it can be very difficult and sometimes impossible to resolve. So before you have a discussion with them, you need to think about, what is the issue? What exactly is it? What am I going to be talking to them about? What is the performance issue? And try to have tangible things to talk about. So targets or specific areas in which they're failing, so you can identify what it is that needs improvement. Then think about, is this the first time this issue has arisen? If it is the first time it has arisen, and if it's particularly in relation to an employee who's been with you for a long time and has previously had good performance, then it might be worth thinking about what's changed. Why have they suddenly changed, and why are they suddenly not performing or not doing the job role that they had been doing successfully before? Then look at whether there are any external factors that could be the reason for the reduction in performance. Thinking about somebody whose behaviour or attitude or performance has suddenly dipped. Is there something going on outside of work that could be impacting that? And then think about, when you have the discussion with the employee, is this going to be the first time they've heard about it? So have you already been talking about the sort of issues with their performance already? If you have regular reviews, regular monthly reviews is what I recommend, although if you can't do monthly, at least quarterly, or at least feedback in terms of targets and performance on a regular basis, then they should understand that they are failing, and this step in the process should be something that they should ideally be expecting, I guess. Then when you've done all of your preparation, I recommend you go through a process of asking yourself, should this be dealt with as an informal or a formal issue? So if it's the first time you've ever discussed it with them, so it is going to come as a complete surprise, then my advice is that you should have an informal discussion with them first to identify the issue and discuss with them, rather than jumping straight to the formal capability process. If you have already discussed it with them and they are aware of the issue, then you need to think about, is the formal process reasonable to start at this stage? Now, the reason I say that is because in the vast majority of cases, once you start the formal capability process, so that is putting someone on a performance improvement plan, for example, it is sort of the beginning of the end for that relationship. There are very few scenarios, in my experience, where somebody's put on a performance improvement plan and then they do improve and then they do go on to have a good, healthy relationship with their manager, for example, going forward. In the vast majority of cases, if you've got to the point of putting someone on a performance improvement plan, then it is really the end of the road. So think about it. Is it reasonable to have that formal process at this stage? What am I going to get out of it? Am I going to get what I need from the employee out of it, or is it going to just cause additional time and stress? And if you get to the stage where really you have been through everything, you've discussed everything with the employee, and you think there is no other way forward in relation to this, it's a will issue, or they're just not getting it and they're failing to understand or take on board the seriousness of the issue, then it may be that that's the time you start the formal process. Now, on that, I do know that there are some organisations who use performance improvement plans as a regular tool for management. So they don't use them in a measured way, mostly because they don't go through the previous steps. It's just poor management. I'm thinking about particularly some financial institutions, perhaps in the past, where they had a very high targeting model for their sales staff, would readily put people on a performance improvement plan. Now, in my view, I don't think you get out of people really what you need by a performance improvement plan. You're much better doing the informal process with them. So what is the formal capability process? And I know this can be confusing for people because they often confuse it with the disciplinary process in relation to conduct issues? Well, there is a similar type of process to follow because capability is one of the potentially fair reasons for dismissal of somebody, and you have to follow a fair and reasonable process in order to reach the decision to dismiss someone fairly for capability. And that involves also following the ACAS Code of Practice, which covers conduct, capability, and some other substantial reason dismissals. And of course, if you don't follow the ACAS Code of Practice, then you could have compensation increased by up to 25% in an unfair dismissal case. And also, the Employment Tribunal will take into consideration the process or lack of process if you do decide to dismiss someone and they make a claim for unfair dismissal. So it is important that you get the capability process right, not least for the legal reasons and the potential financial risk, but also because of the risk that it has in relation to employee relations and the reputation of the business or organisation amongst other staff or potential candidates. It also saves you time in the long run if you get the process right from the outset. So exactly what is the procedure that you should follow in a formal capability process? Well, the first step is to gather the information. So get together the information, the evidence that you have, and the things that you're going to discuss with the employee about their performance. Then it's necessary to notify the employee that you want to have a formal meeting under your capability process and provide them with any supporting evidence or documentation in advance of that meeting. During the meeting, you'll discuss the issues with the individual and set out exactly what the requirements are for their performance going forward. So get their input into it, make notes of what they say, and then come up with a performance improvement plan. So highlighting the key things that you want them to do and obtain or ascertain during that time. And then you need to decide on the timescale for that. Now, the timescale can vary depending on the issues in hand, the nature of their job role, how realistic it is for them to improve within that period of time. Because, of course, if you set somebody a whole range of targets to improve on and you give them a short period of time, you're setting them up to fail. And that's where the reasonableness of your decisions later on could come into question. And, of course, if you set someone up to fail deliberately, then the employee could raise a grievance about the process and or potentially resign and claim constructive unfair dismissal based on your behaviour. So you need to think carefully about the timescales and be realistic. The idea behind a performance improvement plan is to help the employee to reach the standard or targets that you have set. So you want to help them to do that. And it's your job in that process to make sure they have the skill and the tools and the training that they need in order to meet those targets in the performance improvement plan. And you also should review it. Often I see these kinds of processes taking place where an employee has a meeting with their manager, the capability process is started, they're given a formal warning and a performance improvement plan, they're given 3 months in which to meet various targets, and then the manager says nothing to them for 3 months, and then at the end of that 3 months comes back and says, well, you haven't done what I've asked of you, and therefore we're going through the next stage. Again, that's not fair. You need to be making sure that you're having regular discussions with the individual and following up on the plan during the interval between that meeting and the end date for the performance improvement plan. If you reach that point at the end of the timescale that you've set and the individual is not meeting what's required of them, then you need to look at it and consider if it's reasonable to restart again from the second step of inviting them to a further meeting, issuing another warning, and then maybe shortening the timescale and being more strict on what is required of them within that period of time. Now, quite often what happens in that period of time is that the individual will either improve enough so that the process stops, they may go off sick, they may raise a grievance about the way things have been handled, or they might generally be disgruntled. Or in some cases, employees just won't be motivated to do what's required, and therefore you will need to go through the rest of the formal process. But in essence, it's having those meetings, setting the performance improvement plan, giving them a warning, then having a further follow-up giving a second warning or a final written warning, and then depending on how things are going, if they're still not meeting the standards required, then you would have a final meeting which you would then potentially decide on dismissal. Now, the reasonableness of your decision and the length of the process that you need to follow does vary, as I say, depending on the individual's role, what you're asking of them, and the circumstances of your business or the kind of work that they do. Some common issues and questions that arise in relation to the capability process are: can we give an employee a warning after the first discussion? So the answer to that is yes, you can. Again, thinking about the reasonableness of the process. If you've already been through an informal process, you've had those discussions and they're fully aware of what's required of them, but they're still not meeting it, and you've got to the point of the first capability meeting, then yes, it would be reasonable to give them a first written warning, for example, for their failures. The second question I've got is, how long do we have to give them to improve before the next stage? Now, as I said earlier, it does very much depend on the role and thinking about things from a reasonable perspective. If the requirements of their job role are fairly short term and can be measured in a month, then a month may be reasonable. But in some cases, it may be that actually, in order to see that improvement, they need slightly longer. So maybe a month or 2 months or 3 months even. So if an employee just does not do enough to improve, the third question I've got is, if an employee does just enough to improve, can we continue with the process? So this may be where an employee just kind of scrapes through, if you like, in relation to the performance improvement plan. Now, it is possible in this situation, if you're still unhappy with perhaps their attitude or their behaviour, to continue with the performance improvement plan, even if they've met those individual targets or the things you've set under the performance improvement plan. But again, you've got to think about whether that's fair and reasonable to them. So it may be that you just say, okay, we're going to end the formal process and the performance improvement plan because you've met what I've asked of you, but I'm going to keep things under review on an informal basis. And so therefore we'll have regular catch-ups and chats to make sure that you are continuing to maintain the level of capability that's required, for example. The fourth question is, how long can it take until we can dismiss them? Now, again, unfortunately, I can't give you any hard and fast timescale here in relation to what would be considered to be fair and reasonable, but it would depend, again, thinking about all of the things that you've done in advance of this and what you've done to help them improve. And if you can demonstrate to the Employment Tribunal, for example, that you have tried, you have spelt it out, you've given them the training, you've given them every opportunity to improve, then it may not be a very long period of time that you have to wait before dismissal. Certainly, employers don't have to put up with somebody who's not doing their job for a long period of time, as long as you have behaved reasonably. Typically, in a fair performance improvement type dismissal or capability dismissal, it would be about 3 months. But that is just the sort of average in my experience. It can vary depending on the individual situation. And the final question I have is, what if the employee improves for a short time so that the performance improvement plan process ends and then they return to poor performance after that? Now, again, thinking from experience, this can happen quite a lot. Somebody will do just enough to end their performance improvement process, to let the warnings time out, and then their performance drops again. If you see this kind of pattern, then you can call the employee out on it. You can say, look, actually, we've been through this process. You've improved, you've met the targets, but then as soon as it's finished, your performance drops again. Why is that? And you don't have to put up with that. And you could, for example, in the next stage of the process, say, well, actually, the warning's going to stay for a bit longer because every time we've been through this, once the warning expires, then your performance drops again. So we need to be sure that you're maintaining the right level. Again, it is all dependent on the circumstances and being fair and reasonable in the process that you follow. Now, of course, we've talked about the capability process and the fairness of a dismissal or warnings given in relation to that. Now, if you have an employee who has been with you for less than 2 years and therefore doesn't qualify to bring a claim for unfair dismissal, You could modify the procedure in relation to poor performance and capability. So you don't have to go through the full and lengthy performance improvement plan or all of those sorts of things I've just described. However, what I would say is it is important to follow some process. Firstly, because they may have another type of claim, i.e. under the Equality Act. For example, if somebody has a disability which requires reasonable adjustments, and those reasonable adjustments aren't being made and that's impacting their performance and that's why they're not succeeding, and you haven't discussed that with them and you haven't made those adjustments, that could lead to a claim for disability discrimination. But importantly, I would say for newer employees, your role in their success is much more important. So if you've got somebody who's been with you for a short period of time and isn't meeting the required standards, that's where I would go back to it and say, look, have I done the foundation work? Have I done the groundwork here with them? Have I told them what's expected of them? Have I given the tools they need for their job? Have I revisited that with them and supported them enough? It does take time and money to recruit and to bring people on board. So why spend that time and money in recruiting somebody and then setting them up to fail? It's therefore, I think, really important, even if they have been with you for less than 2 years, to at least do some form of process and analysis before you move forward with any kind of warning or potentially dismissal. And of course, if you are going to dismiss them, it's important that you do at least have a meeting with them to set out the reasons why. Let them have their say and communicate the decision in writing. There's nothing worse than an employee who's been with an employer for, say, 18 months being called into a meeting out of the blue and told that they're not meeting the required standards for the role and that you're giving them notice. It just goes down terribly, not only with the individual, but with the remaining staff, and can lead to a number of claims if the employee hasn't had any previous indication that there's a problem with their performance. I see it all the time. Employees will draw an inference that the reason that you've reached this decision is not related to performance, but related to something else, potentially under the Equality Act. So do at least make sure people know what's required of them, they know when they're not meeting the standard, and they know what the potential outcomes are if that continues. And the final thing I just want to touch upon before rounding off this episode is in relation to general poor attitude and disruptive behaviour. Now, this is the kind of behaviour that doesn't necessarily constitute a capability issue, nor is it serious enough for a conduct issue. It's something that's happening quite regularly, in my view, for those people who are just unhappy at work or unhappy with their situation. They're bringing that attitude and that disruption into work, and it's having a knock-on effect on their colleagues and the workplace. And so how do you deal with that? Well, my advice is that you should take the time to get to the root of the issue, trying to find out exactly what the cause is, particularly with an employee who's been with you for some time and where this is new behaviours. If you try to get to the root of the cause, then it can help you to try to resolve it, or at least identify if it's something that can be resolved. So having a conversation with the individual, and if they are not necessarily receptive to trying to explore what the reason is, you should at least have a candid conversation with them in a kind and appropriate way so that you can try to resolve it. So, saying, look, I've noticed that actually you don't seem very happy when you're at work and you are very snappy when people ask you questions. What's the issue? How can we help you to resolve this so that you can go back to being happy at work and enjoying your time here, for example? And then it may be that the disruptive behaviour or the poor attitude becomes serious enough that you then have to deal with it as a potential conduct or capability issue and follow the relevant process. But I do accept that these kinds of sort of low-level behaviours are difficult to deal with, and often it does involve a difficult conversation. Then you should have a look at, or have a listen, should I say, to episode 190 of the podcast, in which I give my tips on having difficult conversations. So there we go. That's my take on how to deal with capability issues. It does start with you, and you as the manager or employer need to look inwardly to see first off if you're doing everything you can to serve your employee. And if you're satisfied that you are, then if you follow a formal capability process and you still don't get the outcome that you desire, you can fairly dismiss an employee for capability or performance related issues. If you have any questions about anything I've covered in this episode, if you'd like to have a capability process drafted specifically for your business if you don't have one, or if you'd like some step-by-step guidance on how to follow a process, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. My email is alison@realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk. We provide advice to employers on these kinds of issues on a regular basis. And of course, if you're an employee listening and you find yourself on the wrong end of an unfair dismissal or a wrongful capability process, then don't hesitate to get in touch. We'll be happy to help. Finally, thank you very much for listening. And of course, if you have enjoyed the episode, do please leave a rating, please follow and or leave a review so others can find us. Have a fantastic 2 weeks ahead. Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.